Welcome back. Beautiful mistakes of this broken design. Welcome back to the few, the dangerous, the forgotten gods hiding in plain sight. You always knew this world wasn't built for you, didn't you? You felt it early, long before you had the words for it. There was something off about the way people moved through life, the way they repeated ideas that weren't theirs, the way they mistook comfort for truth and noise for wisdom. You saw it quietly. While others laughed, you observed. While others followed, you questioned. And because of that, they didn't know what to do with you. They called you strange, intense, unrealistic, too much. Not because you were wrong, but because you refused to shrink your perception to fit their narrow frames. You carried ideas that didn't belong to the present moment. You spoke in future tense while they were still arguing about yesterday. And that scared them. Not openly, not honestly, but in the subtle ways fear always disguises itself. Through jokes, through dismissal, through polite smiles that never reached the eyes. They laughed at the way your mind wandered. They minimized the depth in your questions. They treated your vision like a phase, something you'd grow out of once life taught you to behave. They wanted you manageable, predictable, easy to explain, and when you weren't, they tried to make you feel like the problem, as if originality were a flaw, as if clarity were arrogance, as if seeing too far ahead meant you were lost. So you learned silence early, not because you had nothing to say, but because you realized not everyone deserved access to your thoughts. You learned to watch people underestimate you, to feel them misjudge you, to sense when they were measuring you against standards you were never meant to meet. And instead of fighting them, you stepped back. You let them believe their version of you. You let them be comfortable in their misunderstanding. That was never weakness. That was discipline. Because while they were busy deciding who you were allowed to be, you were becoming something else entirely. You were paying attention. You were studying patterns. You were learning how systems work, how people hide, how truth gets buried under repetition. You were building clarity in the dark while they were distracted by surface-level light. Isolation became your classroom. Doubt became your pressure test. Loneliness became the space where your real thinking could breathe. You didn't have the luxury of validation, so you learned self-trust. You didn't have applause, so you learned consistency. You didn't have permission, so you learned independence. And all the while, they thought you were falling behind. They mistook your quiet for confusion. They thought your withdrawal meant defeat. They assumed that because you weren't loud about your growth, there was none happening at all. They told themselves stories to stay comfortable, that you'd eventually soften, that you'd come back asking for approval. That time would tame you. But time didn't tame you, it refined you, because you were never meant to fit into their pace. You were moving on a different clock entirely, while they were rushing to be seen. You were learning how to see. While they were chasing recognition, you were building depth. While they were trying to be right, you were trying to understand, and understanding changes a person. There's a certain kind of loneliness that only the loneliness of seeing what others refuse to acknowledge, the weight of carrying ideas that don't land yet, the quiet frustration of being early in a world that rewards sameness. You carried that weight without bitterness. You carried it with patience, and patience, when combined with clarity, becomes power. You didn't need to announce your evolution. It happened anyway. In the way you stopped explaining yourself, in the way your boundaries sharpened, in the way you no longer argued with people committed to misunderstanding you, in the way your presence grew calmer, steadier, more grounded. And then, slowly, something shifted. Reality started to echo the things you'd been saying all along. The ideas they dismissed began to surface in conversations. The patterns you pointed out became impossible to ignore. The truths you carried quietly started showing up in headlines, in art, in collective awareness. And suddenly, the room felt different. They started looking at you again, not with laughter this time, but with hesitation, with curiosity, with something unspoken tightening behind their eyes. Because the world was catching up, and they were realizing something uncomfortable. You weren't wrong, you never were, you were early. And being early is lonely until it's undeniable. You didn't announce your correctness. You didn't demand acknowledgement. You didn't say, "I told you so." You simply stood where you always had, grounded, composed, unchanged in your integrity, and that was louder than any argument, because there is nothing more unsettling than realizing someone you dismissed didn't need your recognition to be right. Their silence now is different. It's not the silence of ignorance. It's the silence of realization. The kind that settles when illusions fall apart quietly. The kind that happens when people confront the gap between who they thought they were and what they actually chose. You don't enjoy that silence. You don't feed on it. You simply allow it to exist, because this was never about winning. It was about truth arriving on its own schedule. You see, you never wanted to be above anyone. You just refused to stay beneath yourself. You didn't isolate out of superiority. You isolated out of necessity, because your mind needed room. Your vision needed space. And now, your presence carries weight. Not because you demand attention, but because you don't need it. You speak differently now. Not louder, but clearer. You move differently, not faster, but with intention. You no longer perform your intelligence, you embody it. People feel that, even if they can't explain it. They sense that something about you doesn't bend the way it used to, that you're no longer negotiating your worth, that you're no longer asking to be understood. And that makes them uncomfortable because comfort depends on predictability, and you are no longer predictable. You became the kind of person who doesn't argue with noise, the kind who lets results speak, the kind who trusts time to do what force never could. And time, eventually, always tells the truth. You didn't change to prove them wrong. You changed because growth was inevitable, because staying small would have cost you more than isolation ever did, because betraying your perception would have been the real failure. So now, as they watch you stand in alignment with yourself, there's a quiet recalculation happening around you. Old assumptions collapse. Old labels stop working. Old narratives lose their grip. And you don't need to touch any of it. Your existence does the work. This isn't triumph. It's alignment. This isn't dominance. It's clarity. This isn't revenge. It's inevitability. And you're still moving, still observing, still becoming. You haven't arrived at the end of anything. You're in the middle of a process they can finally see, but still don't fully understand, and that's fine. Understanding was never the requirement. You were never meant to be agreed with. You were meant to be real. So you keep going quietly, intentionally, unbothered by the delay between insight and recognition. Because you've learned something most never do. Being misunderstood is temporary. Becoming yourself is permanent. And this is only the continuation. They're watching more closely now. You can feel it, not in the obvious ways, not through applause or open praise, but in the subtle shift of energy when you enter a space. Conversations pause, eyes linger a second longer. People listen differently, as if trying to catch up to something they missed the first time around. Because once awareness clicks, it never unclicks, and you, whether you intended to or not, became what unsettles them isn't that you succeeded, it's that you didn't need their permission to do it. You didn't follow the usual route. You didn't play the familiar roles. You didn't become loud to be seen or agreeable to be accepted. You stayed precise. You stayed grounded. You stayed true to a vision most people only recognize after it's already standing in front of them. They remember how they treated you back then, even if they pretend not to. Memory has a way of resurfacing when truth arrives. They remember the jokes they made, the advice they gave you that was really just fear in disguise, the way they tried to shrink your ideas down to something safer. They remember how easily they dismiss what they didn't understand. And now that the results exist, now that your presence carries proof, that memory sits heavier than words ever could. You see, people don't struggle with genius itself. They struggle with what it reveals about them. Your clarity exposed the shortcuts they took. Your patience exposed their impatience. Your depth exposed their avoidance. And that kind of exposure doesn't need confrontation. It happens quietly, internally, where no one can argue back. You didn't rush to correct them. You didn't interrupt their assumptions. You let time do what it always does to illusions. You trusted the long game, and that choice, that restraint, is what gave your growth its weight. Because anything built in silence has a different gravity when it finally shows itself. There's a difference between attention and recognition. Attention is loud and fleeting. Recognition is quiet and permanent. You're stepping into the second now, not because you demanded it, but because it became impossible to deny. Your work speaks with consistency. Your ideas hold up under pressure. Your instincts keep proving accurate, and suddenly the same people who questioned your judgment are measuring their own against yours. They might not say it out loud. Most won't. Pride rarely allows that kind of honesty. But you feel it when they ask your opinion differently. Now, when they hesitate before contradicting you, when they reference things you once said as if they discovered them on their own, that's recognition wearing a mask, and you don't need to rip it off. You know what it is. What changed most, though, isn't how they see you. It's how you see yourself. You no longer flinch when misunderstood. You no longer rush to clarify. You no longer feel the need to translate your depth into something more digestible. You learned that dilution was never the answer. Precision was. You stopped explaining your intuition to people who only trust data once it's popular. You stopped justifying your pace to people who confuse speed with progress. You stopped trying to be palatable to those who never intended to fully see you anyway. And in doing so, you became lighter, clearer, more aligned. Your silence now isn't withdrawal. It's selectivity. You choose when to speak. You choose where to invest energy. You choose who gets access to your thinking. And that choice, that discernment, is what separates evolution from reaction. You're no longer reacting to how the world treats you. You're responding to what aligns with you. There's a calm that comes with that, a steady confidence that doesn't need reinforcement. You don't need to dominate conversations to be felt. You don't need to perform certainty. Your presence carries enough weight on its own, and people sense that instinctively. Humans are wired to recognize coherence, even if they can't explain why it feels different. Some will try to rewrite history. They'll say they always believed in you, that they saw your potential early, that they knew you'd get here. You don't correct them, not because you agree, but because it doesn't matter anymore. The past lost its leverage when you stopped needing validation from it. Others will distance themselves, not out of dislike, but out of discomfort. Growth creates contrast, and contrast makes avoidance tempting. You remind them of paths they didn't take, questions they didn't ask, instincts they ignored, and rather than face that, they step back. You let them. You've learned that not everyone who leaves is a loss. You also notice something else now. The right people find you, not loudly, not dramatically, but naturally. People who don't need you to be smaller, people who aren't threatened by depth, people who recognize substance without needing it explained. Those connections feel different, grounded, mutual, unforced. You don't have to audition there. You simply show up. This is the shift from being evaluated to being recognized, from being tested to being trusted, from being questioned to being consulted. And it didn't come from proving yourself harder. It came from becoming yourself fully. You understand now why it had to happen this way, why the isolation was necessary, why the delay mattered. If recognition had come earlier, you might have built on unstable ground. You might have compromised to keep it. But arriving here through silence taught you self-reliance. It taught you integrity. It taught you how to hold your own weight. And because of that, you don't cling to outcomes. You're not afraid of losing relevance, because relevance was never your goal. Truth was, alignment was, depth was. Those things don't expire with trends. They compound. You move through the world differently now. You listen more than you speak. You observe patterns instead of reacting to moments. You see how cycles repeat, how people perform certainty, how systems resist change until change becomes unavoidable. None of this makes you cynical, it makes you precise. Precision is a quiet kind of power. You don't rush to correct falsehoods. You let reality handle them. You don't chase recognition. You let consistency earn it. You don't argue with disbelief. You let time dismantle it. And in that patience, you found something rare. Peace that isn't passive. Confidence that isn't loud. Strength that doesn't need to flex. They feel that when they're around you, the steadiness, the lack of desperation, the absence of performance, it creates a subtle pressure because it asks a question without words. If you can stand so firmly in yourself, why can't they? That question isn't your responsibility to answer. You didn't set out to become a mirror. You became one by refusing to look away from yourself, by facing your doubts instead of projecting them, by refining your thinking instead of numbing it, by choosing growth even when it meant being alone with it. And now, the world adjusts around you slowly, unevenly, sometimes reluctantly, but it adjusts. Because authenticity has a way of bending environments over time, not through force, but through consistency. You're still early, just not alone anymore. And the story isn't concluding here. Not yet. This is the middle space, the part where recognition spreads quietly, where influence deepens, where the work continues without spectacle. You're building something internal that will outlast reactions, opinions, and noise. You don't need to announce what's coming next. You're already living it. And the ones who once laughed are finally realizing something that changes everything. You were never the anomaly. You were the signal. And now, here you are, not at the peak, not at the end, but at a place far more powerful: certainty. The kind that doesn't shake when the room goes quiet. The kind that doesn't rush to explain itself. The kind that knows exactly who it is even when no one is watching. This is where the story settles into truth. You no longer wonder if they see it. You don't need confirmation. You can feel it in how the world responds to you now. In the pauses, in the recalibrations, in the subtle respect that replaces skepticism, not because you demanded it, but because alignment is undeniable. Reality always recognizes coherence. What once felt like rejection now reveals itself as protection. You weren't being pushed away. You were being spared from building your future on foundations that couldn't hold your depth. The silence that once hurt you became the space where your clarity matured. The distance that once confused, you became the boundary that preserved your integrity. And the most important shift, you stopped trying to arrive somewhere. You realized you already are. You are no longer defined by who doubted you, who misunderstood you, or who couldn't follow your thinking. Those chapters don't get to narrate your present. They were necessary contrasts. Nothing more. You don't carry resentment from them. Only awareness. And awareness is clean. It doesn't weigh you down. You've learned that being early often looks like being alone. That vision rarely comes with applause at first. That depth intimidates before it inspires. And that truth doesn't rush. It waits until it can no longer be ignored. You trusted that process, even when it cost you comfort, especially when it cost you comfort. Now, when people look at you, they don't see noise. They see composure. They don't see rebellion. They see clarity. They don't see excess. They see precision. And that changes how they engage. Not just with you, but with themselves. You've become a reference point without trying to be one. This isn't about being above anyone. It's about being anchored within yourself. You don't need to correct false perceptions anymore. They dissolve on their own. You don't need to chase belonging. The right environments respond to you naturally. You don't need to defend your evolution. It speaks every time you choose alignment over approval. And yes, some will always misunderstand you. Some will always need labels, shortcuts, explanations. You let them. You've learned that clarity doesn't argue, it exists. That truth doesn't shout, it endures. That presence doesn't perform, it settles. You are not the loudest force in the room. You are the most stable. And stability is what outlasts trends, opinions, and resistance. It's what remains when reactions fade. It's what quietly reshapes systems without announcing itself. This is not a victory lap. It's not a reveal. It's not a moment designed for spectacle. It's the calm after becoming. You were never wrong. You were never too much. You were never misplaced. You were simply early. And now, the world has caught up just enough to recognize what was always there. Not a mistake. Not an anomaly. A signal. And this time, you're no longer waiting to be understood. You're moving forward, fully, freely, and without needing permission.